Viewers like you make this program possible. Support your local PBS station.
This is the story of energy, humanity's single most important resource. Energy is the force that built our modern world, but it's often invisible to us, hidden in plain sight. Before modern energy, people had to walk miles to get water, carrying it by hand or on their head. With a modern energy system, we can move water with an electric pump, freeing up precious time. Once water is plentiful, we can grow abundant food. And with abundant food, there's extra time for education. Educated people have access to economic prosperity. Some can even operate a business and accumulate wealth. With money, more people move to cities where there's more to do. Cities need transportation to bring goods back and forth. And people are more likely to travel to see the world. All of these luxuries give us a quality of life worth protecting, and even fighting wars over. As a society, we're making decisions about energy that will impact our planet for centuries. So we must understand it. We can understand energy by looking at war.
Energy is required for virtually everything we do. You know, traffic lights, air traffic control, communications, finances, emergency response, basic utilities, water, sewer, they all depend on energy.
Energy is it's the lifeblood of an economy. And that's where overexposure to one source is of great concern.
If we're so dependent on oil, then we're connected to one region in the world much more than the rest. That's a major concern.
We're a very energy-intense society now in the United States and globally. So everything requires a steady supply of energy. So if you don't have it, you're going to have to get it.
Over the last 100 years, we have fought wars over energy, and energy has changed the way wars are fought. Has energy made us more secure or less? This is Power Trip, the story of energy.
Before World War I, which was the first mechanized war, the first war fought with oil, war was fought by foot and by horse.
Avant les sociétés industrielles, les guerres étaient des guerres qui se déroulaient essentiellement l'été.
That was the way wars were fought before, which meant they were smaller scale, they were slower, and not nearly at the risk of massive death the way World War I brought us.
You know, there's the famous adage from, I think, Napoleon, that an army marches on its stomach. Food is just an energy supply for a certain kind of machine. So energy's always been about security, and it's always been a foundational element in our society. But where things really get interesting is in the industrial age.
Wars in the past have been fought over resources like food, water, or even salt. Over the past century, however, wars have been waged with and over energy, particularly oil. The story began in World War I, the first war powered by oil. The power of modern energy had changed war forever, and also left millions dead.
The internal combustion engine gave a lot more power and a lot less space, and that power could be used to move faster, or to move heavier items like a tank, or to even get airborne. And so the availability of that engine really transformed warfare forever.
Avec l'apparition des sociétés industrielles, l'énergie occupe une place encore plus importante. Le charbon, le pétrole deviennent des composantes absolument indispensables de la guerre, mais aussi peuvent être des causes de la guerre et des sources de financement de la guerre.
You look at what happens in the First World War, You're starting off with the fighting in 1914, 1915 amongst the coalfields of Belgium. You tend to think of war as this thing like, in the Napoleonic Wars, Waterloo, farmland with people having battles. Actually, it's almost like an industrial war. And so you get fighting and combat which is happening on an industrial scale.
The growth of steam, coal, oil for Britain in the Industrial Revolution, well, this put it in the 19th century in the forefront, the vanguard of science, the vanguard of industry, and also it became the big trading naval empire nation. And so when it comes to the world wars, Britain goes in with this huge empire. It goes in with this huge amount of scientific innovation and industrialization and a very strong workforce. And I think that's key to winning World War I.
With the coming of the machine, the productivity of each workman was enormously increased. His productivity, thanks to the machine, is higher. This was the promise of the machine.
The growth of tanks, the use of different wartime technologies, these were all being developed in Britain. And when you look at the munitions works in World War I, creating the weapons, creating the bombs, many of them worked in solely by women. The technology they're using there is really the best technology.
Pendant la Première Guerre mondiale, les Alliés, grâce au pétrole américain, disposaient de carburant. Les Allemands n'en avaient quasiment pas.
The importance of energy in World War I was a paradigm shift in the way wars were fought. Before this, wars were still fought on horseback. Now, armored tanks made their large-scale debut on the battlefield. Navies converted from coal to diesel, making oil, which until that point had been a consumer good, into a strategic weapon of war. Just as the internal combustion engine gave drivers the freedom to explore new places for work and tourism, it also freed up military forces. Trucks, tanks, and cars were more nimble than the heavier, slower locomotives, giving Allied forces, which had more vehicles, a military advantage and ultimately securing victory. The British Foreign Secretary remarked, the Allied cause had floated to victory upon a wave of oil. The oil for these vehicles came primarily from the United States and became a target for German U-boats.
England did not have its own oil at the time, so England depended on the United States and its allies to provide the oil. Well, the United States had a lot of oil. We had the Texas oil fields, which were the largest in the world at that time, producing oil at an amazing rate that could fuel the war on behalf of our ally, England.
It was not only oil, but it was an amount of oil so momentous that it changed entire industries. The British, the German, the American naval fleets go from coal over to oil, largely because of Spindletop and attendant discoveries.
Grâce au pétrole, les Alliés vont pouvoir construire des chars qu'ils inventent pendant la guerre. Les Alliés peuvent également construire des camions, des milliers de camions.
I mean, would we have had the automobile industry? Probably not.
It's really, a lot of this is about ownership, possession, and use of energy.
So in the 1930s, we were in a Great Depression. There was a lot of unemployment. The economy was really staggering. We also had a lot of killer floods. We also had killer droughts with the Dust Bowl. So we had many problems all at once, and building dams seemed to be a way to tackle all of them. So we built all these dams in the 1930s for all these other social purposes. Then World War II started in 1939.
Poland, September 1939. All Europe is aflame. World War II is a reality.
After Versailles, the areas that Germany lose are rich in energy resources. Anxiety about and the desire to reclaim and develop energy resources is one of the driving forces behind Germany's looking east to Poland, which has lots of coal.
Coal was an important ingredient in modern warfare. But from the deserts of North Africa to the dense jungles of the South Pacific, World War II was defined by a struggle over a single resource: oil. Without oil, mechanized warfare was impossible. Each side in the war, the Axis and the Allies, both knew this all too well. So every move can be viewed in relationship to energy. Adolf Hitler's plan of a German Reich that would last 1,000 years depended on his ability to capture oil fields in Russia and the Middle East. Imperial Japan's plan of conquest relied upon their access to oil across the South Pacific.
Les Alliés ont un avantage écrasant en termes d'accès à l'énergie. C'est simple, les Alliés disposent de 95% des gisements énergétiques. Il reste 5% pour les Allemands, les Japonais et les Italiens, c'est-à-dire 3 fois rien. Cela montre déjà la folie des puissances de l'Axe quand elles décident de déclencher la guerre.
The Nazi propaganda emphasized the need for living space for Aryan races, and this was part of the argument why Germany needed to expand eastward. Was really energy space, and the German interest in securing future coal fields.
You get the German invasion of Russia in 1941, and one of the aims of that, when they're stretching out across the Soviet Union, is to get hold of the oil fields in the south of the Soviet Union.
There was a real reason for Hitler's march across Europe was to secure access to oil fields in Eastern Europe and to be able to have that.
Germany moved east to get access to oil, but Germany also attacked oil supply lines to undermine British effectiveness in the war and to keep the United States out of it. We had trouble moving oil by boat from place to place because of German U-boats and submarines attacking them. Eventually, the United States built an extensive pipeline network from Texas to the Northeast to move oil by land because it was safer than by boat.
Oil beneath the American earth. Oil for war, the stuff of victory.
The Big Inch and the Little Inch, these two epic pipelines, built in the matter of months.
Joint by joint, well by well, the war emergency pipeline grows. Up from Texas oil to Atlantic seaboard outlets.
It was a feat that would be hard to duplicate today, despite all our modern technology, because of the sense of life and death.
Once we built the pipelines from Texas up to the Northeast, turning valves, and suddenly there's Texas oil and Texas natural gas.
Oil at work gives wings to the bomber, drives the mighty tank. We need rivers of oil behind all the fighting forces. Look, America, at your oil at work and winning a war.
There was a time when the arrival of Texas oil and gas was not taken for granted. It was a real, tangible thing. It made a difference.
The high octane in these blitz cans could have driven all the motor cars in a great city through a traffic-jammed week. And it will, too, in the peace to come, in machines yet to be built, and at 40 miles to the gallon. Oil for freedom, American oil, the blood of the mechanized legion.
As oil demand goes up and oil availability stays level or goes down, there are potentials for more conflict over oil. The war in the Pacific was primarily about Imperial Japan trying to expand their area of influence because of their need for raw materials and oil.
Les Japonais, pour leur part, mettent l'accès au pétrole au cœur de leur stratégie. Leur objectif en 1941, c'est d'accéder le plus vite possible aux Indes néerlandaises. Les Indes néerlandaises, c'est le principal foyer de pétrole de l'Asie. Accéder aux Indes néerlandaises et ensuite décourager les États-Unis de poursuivre la guerre et conserver ces régions pétrolières. Donc c'est une motivation importante pour les Japonais que d'obtenir ce contrôle des gisements de pétrole en Asie.
While Hitler was still brawling in the streets of Munich, Japan had already begun weaving the pattern of aggression when Japan clawed Manchuria out of the body of China. This was not mechanized warfare. By later standards, this war was primitive, trivial, the Japanese cabinet officially labeled it when China protested to the League of Nations. The League branded Japan an aggressor, and Japan resigned, deeply hurt.
They had been on the Allies' side in World War I. Then when they invaded China, of course, they got cut off because the Americans placed an embargo on the exports of these commodities to Japan. And so that then triggered World War II in the Pacific for the Japanese to maintain access to them.
Japan's interest is pretty obvious. Japan is trying to gain access to the oil refineries and the oil reserves that are in what were British and Dutch colonial territories, while at the same time hoping that they'll be able to hold on to them and continue their Pacific expansion from there.
Singapore was the key to their whole strategy. They already were in Indochina because France had fallen to the Nazis, so Vietnam, Saigon was open. So they allowed the Japanese to have their air base from which they bombed Singapore. So what happened was that the British then, in the last hours of the battle, turned their own guns on their own refinery and blew it up. Singapore was the command center for the whole Far East Command of the British. So when it fell, it was, like Winston Churchill said, the worst day in British military history.
People forget that don't study World War II history well enough that the whole reason why the Japanese were doing the island hopping that they were doing, they recognized they had to have access to oil. They had to have access to energy. So we recognize that an empire's dependence on energy, in that case oil, leads to them making bad decisions.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Because of some of their other actions in the region, we had placed embargoes, oil embargoes on Japan. When they attacked Pearl Harbor, they didn't touch the oil supplies in Pearl Harbor. They took out the U.S. Navy to the degree they could, but left the oil intact. I don't know if they thought they could come back and get it, or I'm not sure what all their motivations were. They made a mistake. It backfired on them, if you will.
With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
En 1944, l'Allemagne domine encore une grande partie de l'Europe, en particulier l'Europe de l'Ouest. La France, la Belgique, les Pays-Bas ont été conquis par les Allemands depuis 1940 et sont toujours occupés. Le mur de l'Atlantique est une ligne de fortification qui court du Danemark, littoral de la mer du Nord de l'Allemagne, Pays-Bas, Belgique, France, jusqu'à la frontière espagnole, construit par les Allemands à partir de 1941 pour essayer de repousser l'inévitable débarquement qui arrivera des îles britanniques. Le mur de l'Atlantique n'est pas homogène. Pour défendre les plages, les Allemands ont installé un réseau de bunkers, certains avec mitrailleuses, certains avec canons. Nécessairement, tous ces bunkers sont électrifiés. Ils disposent de générateurs qui les alimentent en énergie. Pour préparer l'invasion, les Alliés ont entamé une campagne de bombardement stratégique, affaiblir l'économie allemande en bombardant les usines en Allemagne, bref, de faire le plus de mal à tout le réseau énergétique allemand. Le 6 juin 1944, les forces armées britanniques, canadiennes, américaines, après des mois, plus d'un an de préparation, franchissent la Manche et débarquent en Basse-Normandie pour entamer la libération de l'Europe de l'Ouest. 6000 navires, plusieurs centaines de milliers d'hommes débarquent en quelques heures sur les plages normandes. Une fois le débarquement réussi, les Alliés vont progresser jusqu'à entrer en Allemagne. Il va falloir donc pousser le ravitaillement, accompagner les troupes avec le ravitaillement.
Just getting hundreds of thousands of people to the beaches of Normandy took an incredible amount of fuel. Moving further took even more fuel for the jeeps and the trucks and the tanks, but it also took jet fuel for the planes flying overhead that were softening up the forces on the other side.
Les Alliés percent le front allemand et d'un coup peuvent filer de plusieurs centaines de kilomètres à travers la France. Dans ces conditions, on n'a pas le temps de rétablir le réseau ferroviaire, on n'a pas le temps de poser des oléoducs. On va quand même pas demander à Patton de s'arrêter le temps de les poser. Donc, il faut improviser.
Up forward, the armies were on the move. One thing saved the day, the Red Ball Highway, a trucking job that carried the goods from the docks of Cherbourg to the armies at the front. The schedule, 24 hours a day.
Amateurs study tactics, but professionals study logistics. Sure, we can pitch a battle between two different groups like you see in the movies or you read in history, but it's everything that led up to that battle, and then more importantly, should you become the victor, what it takes to sustain those forces wherever they are.
La Red Ball Express Highway, qui est une route réservée au ravitaillement, à sens unique, où vont circuler 6000 camions pour amener de l'essence, des munitions, des rations aux troupes qui sont au front, essayer ainsi de maintenir le tempo et d'éviter la panne sèche.
In 81 days of operations, the Red Ball carried 500,000 tons, 1,000 million pounds of supplies. The trucks themselves devoured 200,000 gallons of fuel. The American drivers and packers and loaders and maintenance men did a job that had never been done before in the history of war.
The Red Ball Express is what ultimately defeated Hitler, was our ability to mass that kind of logistics. Much of it was energy in the form of fuel and diesel to be able to power our vehicles, and that is how we won World War II in the final days.
Everybody needed lots of fuel, lots of oil and gas. We cut off Hitler's supply of oil from North Africa. He tried to go into Russia, that didn't work. They actually developed synthetic fuel. Germany used a lot of Fischer-Tropsch fuel, named for two German scientists, Fischer and Tropsch. It can be made from coal or anything with carbon and hydrogen molecules in it. And they were in a desperate situation, but it works very well.
Deadly, effective. Tactics like that work. That's why more of our men came home than theirs.
World War II was certainly fought out on battlefields, but it's also obviously fought out in industrial factories. Having the production capacity to produce weapons, to produce tanks and planes and guns was crucial. In World War II, one of the main things that was needed for certain kinds of military production was aluminum.
Enough aluminum is stored here to lay a silver carpet over every street in Tokyo. Aluminum sheet to be brought to life by these machines and the workers who operate them.
Parmi les métaux les plus importants de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, il y a sans doute l'aluminium. Parce que l'aluminium est 3 fois plus léger que l'acier, et c'est donc un métal absolument indispensable pour les avions. Parce que imaginez, un avion 3 fois moins lourd peut emporter peut voler plus vite, il est plus agile, il emporte plus de bombes et il emporte plus d'essence.
People don't often think about it, but when you buy aluminum, you're basically buying electric power.
The reduction process requires vast amounts of electrical energy.
Where is aluminum produced? Mostly in places where electric power is really cheap. Producing aluminum in the Tennessee Valley was driven very largely by cheap hydroelectric power because of the dams that were built for the TVA, that were built in the 30s and early 40s.
One of the things to understand about rivers and national security is the Corps of Engineers. So the Corps of Engineers is broken up into different districts. So there's the Wilmington District, North Carolina, the Norfolk District in Virginia. And they had this strange project that was built around how are we going to basically build the technology behind the bomb. They needed to do it under the Department of Army, and that fell under the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And they ended up putting it under the Manhattan, New York district of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and so that's why it's known as the Manhattan Project.
The first chain reaction is demonstrated at the University of Chicago, and that nuclear chain reaction gives off heat. Today we use it for nuclear power for peaceful purposes to make electrical power, but you could also use it in an uncontrolled way for a weapon to release a lot of power in a short amount of time in a way that's very destructive.
So the Manhattan Project and the development of the bomb was actually spread all around the United States, and so the national labs are really the root of it.
The atomic bomb program was sited, a big part of it, at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Why was it put there? Cheap electric power for some of the operations in separating out uranium isotopes for the first atomic bombs.
Oppenheimer divvied out the technology behind the bomb into different places for security reasons. And one of the things that they needed to do was refine uranium, which is an inordinately energy-consumptive process. And so Oak Ridge National Lab, it was kind of built in this nook and cranny where nobody would ever look. And the Tennessee Valley Authority was powering that entire process. Now, the irony of that was basically the Army was making a call on electricity from the TVA, and they didn't tell them what they were using it for. They were just using an enormous quantity of power.
At its peak of enrichment in World War II, a measurable fraction of national electricity consumption was just for uranium enrichment, which is incredible.
They needed a crazy amount of electricity for all of these activities, and during the 1930s and 1940s, the primary source of that much electricity was pure hydropower.
The productive capacity of Japan versus the United States is tiny. Germany was a major industrial power, but nowhere near the scale of the United States.
Hitler did not necessarily get beat tactically on the battlefield. It's just that logistically we finally were able to squeeze him off from supplies, squeeze him off from oil and sources of energy, and they basically ran out of gas.
The whole war machine runs on oil, it runs on hydrocarbons, and it's upon that success or victory or defeat rests.
The United States had an enormously larger economy. Just more people, more bucks, more power in the literal sense, and more productive capacity, which enabled it to replace all of the armaments that were lost in the course of combat, whereas Japan and Germany were unable to do that.
The gradual defeat of fascism and imperialism in World War II was due to more than just abundant and reliable sources of oil and water in America. However, if it had not been for these natural resources, the speed and scale of the mechanization of the U.S. military and her allies would have been significantly reduced, particularly in the early years of the conflict. The fact that these resources existed and were already being tapped and utilized in the 1930s contributed significantly to the conduct of the war and its ultimate outcome.
Cheap oil changed the modern world in so many ways. First of all, it meant that products from oil were very cheap, including gasoline and diesel. And the oil age came upon us together with the internal combustion engine. Car ownership really took off after World War II. It was only after World War II that the American economy was recovering, people had money, they had the desire, the cars were available, and we weren't in a war effort. And that's when car production and ownership really took off.
The benefits of energy were often double-edged. In the middle of the 20th century, more families were able to own cars than ever before. Car culture grew as energy became more plentiful. Meanwhile, inexpensive forms of energy were also helping to fuel something else: an arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States. During this Cold War, energy innovations led to nuclear missiles with a new global reach and the potential for mass destruction. As transportation options continued to expand for Americans and Europeans, there was a greater need for oil than ever before. But domestic oil production in the U.S. began to decline.
Our industrial progress and economic growth was fired by what many seemed to look on as endless energy. But warning signs were there. Until 1950, the United States could supply the energy needed. But in less than 25 years, we found ourselves in trouble. Crude oil production dropped. Oil companies during this period were encouraged to get oil and gas from other countries. By 1970, we imported 1/3 of our oil and gas, relying on others to meet new needs.
Geography is a part of the geopolitical story of oil, partly because of who has oil to produce it and who consumes oil. And for a long time, the oil was produced most abundantly in the Middle East, in countries like Saudi Arabia, for example. And the consumers were elsewhere. The consumers were in Europe, or the United States, or now China. This geographic distinction invites this national security vulnerability. The risk for the United States and Europe is that the flow of oil will be disrupted because of foreign policy differences, as the oil had been disrupted in the 1970s. And that disruption causes prices to spike, causes resources to be unavailable, and is a major disruption to the economy and our national security position.
Energy and security have certainly been tightly linked for a long time, but for the United States, I would say that the real focus began in the 1970s with the oil embargoes.
America's energy demands have grown so rapidly that they now outstrip our energy supplies. As a result, we face the possibility of temporary fuel shortages and some increases in fuel prices in America.
By the 1970s, the United States and Europe were highly dependent upon Middle Eastern oil. Arab oil-producing nations, angry over support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War, reduced their oil output by about 5 million barrels per day and fixed prices 500% above their prior levels. Those oil constraints led to gasoline scarcity and high prices at the pumps. And then in the late 1970s, disruption of oil supplies from the Iranian Revolution created economic and geopolitical aftershocks that reverberated globally. The two crises caused long lines at gasoline stations and high energy prices that pinched pocketbooks, inconvenienced drivers, and became a defining moment of the 1970s. And both events helped shape oil security concerns for decades to come.
Let our position be absolutely clear. An attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States of America, and such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force.
So President Carter said, oil is worth fighting over. A decade plus later, President Bush launched a war over oil under the Carter Doctrine.
Saddam Hussein wanted access to Kuwaiti oil fields and Kuwaiti infrastructure and Kuwaiti ports and all of the nice things that the Kuwaitis have down there, and he decided to take it. We had a large force massed in Kuwait, and the decision was made to get into the rear area of the Iraqi army and destroy them from really a couple of fronts. So in order to do that, a large portion of our forces had to drive out into the desert for days and set up that attack from the flank. So in order to move all of those armored vehicles into the desert and set up that attack, it required a large amount of petroleum products. That required energy to move it. You know, there might have been other ways to win the war, but what really allowed it to happen was the logistics of it all.
Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait to get access to Kuwaiti oil, and the United States invaded back to push him out to protect that oil. And as Saddam Hussein and his troops retreated, they set oil wells on fire.
They didn't want Kuwait or Saudi Arabia or whoever to get the oil benefits to help pay for the war. They wanted to punish somebody for asking for our help. A number of reasons. Who knows what they all were, but it was just to create havoc. They contend that Kuwait was doing slant drilling and stealing Iraqi oil. Those things can be adjudicated in international courts or whatever, but you don't do what they did. We got experts from the oil industry, many of them in Texas, that put out oil well fires when they do occur, but they were just one after the other. And the dramatic, not only economic impacts to the region, but the environment around the world.
You know, that's one of the greatest examples of oil, petroleum products, and fossil fuels being used as a weapon. And, you know, essentially saying, if we can't have them, then we'll deny them to you as well. But they underestimated the will of the world to fix that problem.
Ten years ago, the United States was importing 60% of its oil, and we had no choice. We had a new thing happening in 2008, sort of a demand crisis. China's economy comes booming in and is competing in demand for all this oil, for all this energy, and prices just skyrocketed. And of course, what happens when that happens? There was a correction. And in the United States, we had an innovation boom with hydraulic fracturing.
Because of it, we have increased our domestic oil and natural gas production. And what that has done is caused prices at the gasoline pumps and natural gas prices drop. What we saw is the power sector in the United States shift more to natural gas than to coal. What that means is we've actually reduced the carbon intensity of our electricity production here in the United States. And it's been actually fairly dramatic.
So 2008, we're importing 60%. 2018, we're only importing 20% of our oil. And I wouldn't say that too much of it is from places we would consider adversaries or hostile.
So in the 1970s, we forbade the export of energy to make sure we weren't under the thumb of the Middle East. And then in 2015 and beyond, we encouraged the exports of energy to help Europe, our ally, get out from under the thumb of Russia.
It's not a bad thing to have a global economy where we're all trading and where oil, which is a fungible commodity, can move around where it needs to be. It's a much more stable way to have a market for something as fundamental and foundational as energy.
This geographic distinction invites this national security vulnerability because that country could decide not to sell oil to the customer, or that oil is vulnerable to attack or disruption along the way. The oil would pass through these choke points, places where there's a geographic narrowing, like the Suez Canal, or the Strait of Malacca, or you have the Strait of Hormuz, where something like 15 million barrels per day of oil flow through on the way to customers around the world.
If someone were to sink a tanker in that strait, it could block all shipments from the Middle East for up to 30 days. Interesting fact is that when the U.S. SEAL team took down bin Laden, there were tanker plans on his desk. It's a scary situation.
Energy is absolutely a vulnerability. You know, we always think of war as being armies clashing on a plane, but at the end of the day, an adversary is going to attack you wherever he or she can. And so infrastructure has always been a target in a time of war.
There are three major grids in the United States. 90% of the military bases in the United States have a single power feed to the base. They're dependent almost entirely on the electric grid of the United States. If the grid goes down, the base goes down. Terrorists thought they could take out the eastern grid, take out all power to all states from Maine to Florida. That would be a dramatic impact on the United States. It's out for days. Now there's no financial transactions, no digital communications, basic utilities like water and sewer, transportation is impacted, and the military relies heavily on electric power to conduct its missions here in the U.S., to conduct missions overseas that are remotely operated from bases in the U.S., to power our land-based ballistic missile defense system, and to do emergency response and support of troops around the world.
If you can cut off the electricity supply to a military headquarters or to a stock market, to an airport, you can have a really dramatic effect. I think it's something that we take for granted in this country, in the United States, because it's just always there. It's omnipresent. You don't even really register anymore that there are wires and there are transformers. We take it for granted that this huge machine is always going to function. The fact that we are still part of a global market now as an exporter, not just as an importer, is actually writ large a good thing. It's a much more stabilizing force for the global economy. However, it does mean that all of us together, all these countries together, are depending sometimes on suppliers who are not honest brokers like Russia. President Putin and Russia have become such a toxic actor in the region that you can't pretend anymore that it's not a problem.
This is a Russian invasion. The U.S. says it has no doubt these are Russian forces and has demanded their immediate withdrawal.
In light of the fact that Russia was such an enormous supplier of natural gas to Europe, there was a meeting of the G7 plus the EU to take a step back and relook at the questions of energy security.
Russia looms large in that because Russia is such an important supplier of both oil but especially natural gas. Sooner or later, you got to make a choice. Is it going to be Russia or is it going to be Iran? Because there's only so much really large reserves of natural gas in the world, and those are two of the largest. So I think at some point, that becomes a really difficult choice.
The fact that our European allies are so dependent on Russian gas meant that we also have a natural gas security issue.
Russia's been the big supplier. Iran, of course, is not an option at the moment. It's under sanctions. But someday, if you're going to continue to supply Europe with natural gas, you're going to have to get it from somewhere.
Energy security is not just a question about oil. It's also a story about nuclear energy. Today, that shows up in discussions with countries like Iran that want to build nuclear power plants so that they can have more electricity. But the rest of the world has concerns that Iran will use the nuclear capabilities to develop weapons instead of power plants. So to this day, we grapple with energy security questions tied up with nuclear rather than oil because of the connections between nuclear power plants and weapons.
I was part of the Iran negotiation. That agreement provided unprecedented verification measures forever to give the world the greatest insight into making sure Iran was not developing a nuclear weapon. I think we need regimes of that type anywhere where we have new nuclear power being deployed, if those countries have aspirations not just for nuclear power, but for the facilities one needs to supply nuclear power, like fuel fabrication and the like. If there is motion towards nuclear power, it is very, very essential that the highest standards of non-proliferation requirements be placed on those programs.
Diversification like that is one of the great ways to cut your energy vulnerability. Economists have talked forever about the resource curse, that when you are gifted as a country with such a wonderful resource, that it can starve the rest of your economy. It's already happening. I mean, some of the projections for Saudi Arabia are that between their high consumption rates and their demographics, that they're headed for a point where they're not going to be able to export. So that's existential for them long before climate change will force them to make a transition.
The countries, particularly in the Middle East, but the countries more broadly that depend on fossil fuel production, they need a new business model going forward to a low-carbon world. However, those energy security principles are not simply about oil and gas. They are about renewables, about energy efficiency, because renewable sources, those are domestic resources.
The problem right now is that the planet, especially as India and China now have a middle class that want to enjoy the same comforts that we, the United States, had and our middle class have had, it's only natural. What's different is the scale. The middle class of China alone is estimated to be between 300 and 400 million people, which means that it's larger than every single person in the United States. Our shale and our efforts in fracking have made us capable, the United States, of producing more, but it's not enough to meet the world's demands, and that's why we need to move more quickly towards renewables.
The problem, I think, is that the general public doesn't see it as a big an issue as the U.S. military does.
In order to provide security, we have to have soldiers. Soldiers require food. That requires energy and water. Soldiers require water treated with energy. So then if you go up to the equipment level, a tank, an Apache helicopter, those require a lot of energy to produce, but they require a lot of energy to operate and a lot of energy to maintain.
The Air Force, when we refuel airplanes in the air, costs us $26 a gallon. Fuel is only $3 a gallon, but it costs you $23 to get it to them in the air. So it's not just the cost of fuel, it's getting it to where we need it when we need it.
But then if you operate that piece of equipment and those soldiers in a combat environment, you have to not only have those things available, fuels, energy, water, those kind of things for heat, you have to move that to the combat theater, which requires more energy.
Everything that we do in the military, we either have to bring it with us, it has to be dragged in, trucked in, or flown in, and that's hard to do logistically. Any operation wants to lower costs overall, and one of the best ways to do that is through fuel costs.
So our security is very much tied into energy in the form of fossil fuels as well as other forms of energy.
We use a lot of oil. In fact, the U.S. military uses 100 million barrels of oil per year. We're too dependent on a single source of fuel, oil, and we need to be more diversified.
You can be as effective as we are right now as a military, and at the same time, without losing any capability, you can be more efficient as well.
The military has a real opportunity. We have all of this land, and the military has been working through how we do public-private partnerships to allow private investors to be able to put wind or solar into military installations and the land they own, and then give back that electricity, and it's a wonderful win-win situation.
We've done a lot in the U.S. military to try and reduce our demand for energy. We did a lot of things to try and save fuel, to use less fuel, be more efficient. We've moved towards more renewable energy.
There's other things that our military installations did for decades, which was to not even measure energy usage inside of our buildings. And you can't fix what you can't measure.
The military from 2007 to 2015, in that 8-year period, reduced our use of petroleum products by over 20%. The general public hasn't done that.
We, the people of the United States, have had a land of plenty. We had resources to burn, and we burnt them. Germany and Japan scrimped while we squandered.
My grandmother was a child of the Depression and then an adult of World War II. So it was ingrained in her to not waste. They just didn't have enough. So anything that you had or brought into your home, you used at least 3 or 4 times.
The nitro from 2 pounds of fat means 5 shots from an anti-tank gun.
We were able to create a patriotic reason to be able to think about ways to be more resilient or to recycle more.
Saving is as easy as squandering. You give us the scrap. We'll turn it into tanks. We'll turn it into planes. We'll turn it into jeeps. We'll turn it into guns. Then our fighting men will have enough and on time.
It just drives me crazy that we haven't been able to reconnect that sense of patriotism. It was no less patriotic in World War II than it should be today to be able to be more resilient with how we're using our resources.
A lot of our energy policy since 9/11 and 2001 has really focused on energy security as opposed to energy prosperity or energy cleanliness. And what I think is that all of these things are related. An energy system that lets us live in a clean, safe, and prosperous world is really the goal. And focusing too much on oil security at the expense of dealing with the environment and the economic consequences would be a bad thing to do.
There's always been a tension between short-term energy security and long-term energy security. However, some of those things that might give you stability in the short term are causing your problems in the long term. So, that tension between how do we get security today and how do we get security tomorrow is a really tough one.
As we go forward, if we are using energy and our energy policies correctly, we have a real opportunity to do something pretty cool, which is to incentivize decentralized production. They don't have to be just wind and solar. It could be geothermal. It could also be hydro, giving more countries the ability to make their own and be less dependent on others.
There is no right answer. I've had people say, solar is the answer. No, it's not. Wind is it? No, it's not. It's a combination and mix of these various sources of energy that provides the security we need.
It also means that fewer actors will be motivated to make bad decisions like we've done in the Middle East for the last 50, 60 years because of our dependence upon oil.
So I think it's an interesting, broader way now of looking at energy security issues that will serve us well.
I hope the lessons from energy security that we take forward into the future is that the less we consume, the more secure we are, and the more we produce, the more we can determine our own fate and help our allies. It's a balancing act. We have to manage all three of these challenges. We have to make energy clean, affordable, and secure.
Energy security means different things to different people. Energy security in the U.S. means reducing imports of oil from the Middle East or improving the reliability of the grid. In the developing world, energy security means gaining access to energy. Will we still fight wars over energy? And will energy still be a deciding factor in war? Energy has reshaped warfare in the past, and we can expect it to continue to do so. The question that lingers is whether energy has made us a more or less secure society. Energy shortages will continue to be a cause of conflict. So what can we do now? We can all conserve energy, as we were encouraged to do during World War II. At the same time, we need innovation. Designing new energy systems that diversify the forms of energy we use and increase availability of resources not only reduces risk, but also serves as a pathway to peace with our neighbors. And we all have a role to play in that story of energy.